centuries condemned us brutally, fit us into a mold they shaped for us, one that they always want for us. Women have struggled, toiled and fought. We have fought to be seen and won. We have won the right of suffrage. We still have many fights to win. But have no place at your table. That's the rule, you say. That's the rule. But life should not be so cruel. Who set the rules? It's you say. All the care, work, and taxes I pay. From a little that I own. But where does my money go? Every day, everywhere we pay taxes to eat, to heal, to die. You bury us in taxes. You rest on our belabored backs. But we shall neither rest on the poor. Rewrite the rules to make them right. For justice and equality. Rewrite the rules, we want them right.
So, hello everyone. We are here for this webinar. This is about tax justice and debt justice, which we are having this time. And I'm Saima Zia from Pakistan Kisan Rabta Committee. I'm your moderator for today. And I have to request all of you that please introduce yourself in the chat box with your name and organization. And this webinar has been organized by the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development and European Network on Debt and Development. And obviously, it has been organized in collaboration with the APF, Asia Europe People's Forum, which is a civil society a network of progressive civil society organizations in Europe and Asia. So we all are here, and we are just these are all sessions of this APF 13 will be recorded and be available on social media and on their website too. So in today's webinar, we will discuss about our panelists are here. They are from different organizations, and some of them they will talk about the tax justice, and some of them talk about the debt. What is the situation of debt especially in southern countries, and how this have been affecting the situation of pandemic here, and debt it's making the situation worse of this pandemic, especially during the COVID times. And Asia Europe People's Forum's network is working for fighting for the justice and for the injustice, all type of inequalities in the society. So here we are, through our panelists and speakers, we will talk about the issues which have been more making the situation more worse of about tax justice, and how this money of tax and not have been utilized for the basic health facilities to the to the communities. And especially we will talk about the women's perspective, how the marginalized communities in our areas that have been at the stake at this time. The situation is very worse and they are at the stake, and how they can be how we can make this tax and debt situation more better for them, and how we can say and we can push for more for the debt cancellation, for especially for the southern countries, that they can be cope up with this situation, because it is very difficult even for the rich countries. They cannot able to fight this pandemic. And say, obviously this is the more worse situation here in our countries, especially in South Asia and Asian countries, which are at the stake of the companies and the rich countries, because we are always under debt. And this for this to cope up this situation, some of the countries like Pakistan is also getting more money from IMF, because they don't have money to handle the situation. So this will increase the crisis more after some time, and this is not the way how we can going to fight the pandemic. So we need to find out the solutions for not only for the pandemic situation, but what about the social rights and the basic human rights, and what about the women rights, what we are suffering the more, and the more vulnerable women are the more vulnerable community. Like we started with the video, you can see there that we women, we demand that these taxes, this money that have been paid to the government should be we need to we need to focus on this. We need to push the governments. This money should be more gender focused. This budget, our budgets would be more gender focused. And how we can stop this illicit financial flows, how we can push our governments to make accountable these companies who are trying to steal money from our people. So I will not take too much time of talking, and I will like to invite our first speaker. But before that, before inviting our first speaker, I would like to suggest that if you will have any questions or queries, you can to the panelists, you can put it in the not you should not put it in the chat box, but there is a separate question answer box there. So you should put your question answer there. So it will be easy for us to answer all your question, and we can take them easily. So first of all, I would like to invite May, who is from APMDD. APMDD is Asian People's Movement Debt and Development, and she will be talking about the perspectives and demands of South movements here. And May, it is over to you now.
Yes, thank you very much, Saima, and I hope you can all hear me clearly. I'm going to share my screen now. Hold on. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, you can see it.
Oh, okay, so this is a very short sharing on what we mean by debt justice from our experiences as South peoples, from what we've been living through for decades with regards the debt problem, which did not only erupt with the pandemic, no, but has been with us for a long time. So, what are this is a sharing on the perspectives and demands of South movements. Okay, so we are now in a multiple crisis that is often said is unprecedented and unparalleled, and indeed it is. And in this context, we hear a lot being discussed about the debt burden, the debts being claimed from the South, and how it's adding to the burdens of addressing the pandemic. But we know from our experiences that it has a long history and that different schemes, debt relief schemes in the past, have not been able to solve this debt burden. And Yolanda will speak about this later on the most recent debt packages that are being offered to us. So debt service, which means paying the debts, no, in terms of the principal and the interest. This is just an estimated figure of 300 billion, which is spent annually by the South on external debt payments, no? And this does not even include private creditors, no? It, actually, this does not come into the picture that nearly half of public external debt is owed to private lenders. So these are some of the realities in Asia in the context of the pandemic, that all these billions of public money that are bleeding away instead of going into real life saving measures, no? Um, and in part or in large part, our governments are also complicit or responsible because they are acquiescent to the pressure to prioritize debt service over human life and survival and the climate. And we're also compelled to pay these debts even at the expense of our rights. So, for example, the situation in India right now, and perhaps spreading also to South Asian countries, is that they're still paying this debt service while their people are practically or literally gasping for life. No? So this is debt injustice, that debt service eats up the funds that are supposed to go to people's needs, responses for COVID, and so on. No? But debt injustice also involves a bigger and central issue that goes beyond the immediate impacts. Um, Many of us will recall that in decades past, we've actively addressed the debt issue, and it continues to this day because it's actually a legacy of our colonial history and a long history of colonial plunder of the resources and wealth of the South. So these historical roots have been deepened through supply-driven lending by creditors, the aggressive pushing of loans, and of course, unjust economic relations across countries, including financial relations and transactions such as lending and borrowing. And the loans have also come with conditionalities, which we are very familiar with, and they've been able to shape our economies in a way that conforms with neoliberal policies, such as opening local economies to foreign direct investment and eroding those local livelihoods. And of course, fiscal consolidation, or what we know as austerity, which has led to the privatization of essential social services. So just a look at how this past now haunts us in the present, because our public health systems, for example, for one, very critical to fighting COVID, is so weakened due to neglect and lack of resources. And of course, because governments have opted to give this or surrender this mandate to the private sector. No? So, for example, if you look at the ICU beds per 100,000 population, you will see all of us here, these countries, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, Nepal, here at the rightmost end, where you cannot imagine zero point 0.5 beds in Bangladesh for 100,000 people. And also in the Philippines, here in the picture, they've mounted protests. So it's very good that we recognize the work of the health workers, but this must be translated into, granting their demands for higher wages. So another expression of debt injustice is what we call illegitimate debts. So this one is about an ADB funded project in India. You might have heard of this, which is Tata Mundra. No? And this is an example of debts that are contracted in our name, but which we paid for, and perhaps and many of those we're still paying for with the use of public funds. Illegitimate debts also include the debts of private corporations that have been assumed by the public, by the government. So in effect, people are paying for those debts. So these illegitimate debts, which we're referring to, have not benefited people, but have in fact been used to finance socially and environmentally harmful projects, and of course led to the worsening of the climate crisis, exploited women's labors, bound us to highly onerous and unfair terms, violated rights and democratic processes and laws, and threatened our future and those of generations yet to come. Okay, so in this slide, we point out.
Hello, Maya, sorry to interrupt you. Can you please put your PowerPoint on full screen, because people cannot see the font? If you can do it, please.
I'm sorry. Is it now on full screen?
Yeah, it's full screen now. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. So yeah, sorry for that. So this slide shows a fundamental problem on how the debt crisis is seen. So we hear a lot of talk about debt crisis here and there, but what is that crisis and from whose perspective? So from the perspective of the creditors, they are facing a debt crisis because of borrowers that are not able to keep their debt service payments. No? So really like a business of lending. No? So if you're in the business of lending, if your borrowers cannot pay, it's a huge problem for you. But in the South, we are saying that we are in a debt crisis that is permanent and continuing. And debt service is prioritized over needs and rights. It eats up a huge chunk of public funds that we need for our development, for sustainable development, for essential services, for the current crisis, the COVID responses. So that's a very basic difference in looking at the debt problem, the debt crisis that is referred to, and even the debts claimed from peoples of the South. So what are our demands for debt justice? So first of all, having laid the basis of the nature of that debt, it's it's essentially unjust. Our first demand is the cancellation of unsustainable and illegitimate debt. So this must be done deeply and involving a wider public, And there must be debt cancellation for all vulnerable countries, and not only the low income countries, but including the middle countries. A cancellation by all lenders and creditors, official and private. So initially, demand has been put forward for a cancellation beginning with a minimum of debt payments for at least 4 years and without penalties. And whatever is freed up from the public funds freed up from such suspension should go into appropriate measures to address the multiple crises. Secondly, in the immediate, we say no to COVID fiscal responses that are in the form of loans. Third, we also call for a United Nations process and mechanism for comprehensively addressing unsustainable and illegitimate debt, including comprehensive debt audits of both lenders and borrowers. And fourth, the adoption of international and national rules for fair, responsible, democratic lending and borrowing processes and contracts. So finally, I'd like to share with you here a quote from our coordinator, no, Lidina Kupil, that the fight goes beyond debt cancellation, but for reparations for the historical, social, economic, ecological, and climate debt owed to our peoples. And we must wage this fight as part of a broader struggle to transform the fundamentally flawed system that has been built on and perpetrated injustice and inequality in various dimensions while devastating our people and our planet. So I end there and invite you to visit these links for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, May. May is leading the debt justice team in APMD. So she has been very specific in her presentation that how we and why we are demanding the debt justice. Thank you, May. And is there any question further for May here, or should we move to the next speaker? I'm not able to see any. Okay, so we will go and move to the next speaker. The next speaker is Lulana Frisnello. And if I have been wrongly pronounced your name, please correct me, Lulana. And she is the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer. And she will tell us about the state of play and international debt cancellation and debt relief initiatives by the government and international institutes. So it is over to you, Lolana.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Simon. And thank you, Mai, for this introduction. And special thanks for colleagues at the APMD for putting so much effort in having this, this panel. Mai was telling us about what debt justice means for movements in the Global South, which we share, and also what solutions should be put forward. And it will come as no surprise for all of you to know that so far the institutional response to the debt, to the worsening of the debt crisis, because as Amaya was saying, the debt crisis was already there before the COVID, and debt was already affecting people's rights and people's lives. So the institutional responses to this worsened debt crisis falls very short from those demands. The G20, the IMF, the World Bank have so far only produced short-term limited responses to the situation that for us are not more than distractions or false solutions to make sure that actually nothing's changed in substance. The evident shortcomings of the existing financial international architecture to deal in a timely, orderly, comprehensive, and especially on a fair manner with the debt situation, with the debt crisis, tell us how vital and urgent it is to put in place those systemic changes that Maya was mentioning. Not only as a system change in general, but also specifically in the debt architecture. And unfortunately, as I was saying, we're far from the needed reform or the needed revolution, depending on how you see it. Let me tell you a little bit about which or what have these responses been so far. The G20 approved last year in April what it's called the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. This is an initiative that provides temporary, and I think the word temporary is very important here, temporary debt payments moratoria, so a standstill to debt payments for a very limited group of countries. So far, 45 countries are participating, which are mostly low-income countries or lower middle-income countries. And it has merely provided around, and so in 2020, around $5 billion debt temporary payment suspension. And the temporary is important because this means that this money has to be paid, in a couple of years, the repayments will restart. There has been an extension during this year, so the initial initiative was for 2020, but this year they have extended it throughout all the year. And this could provide an additional around $7 billion US dollars temporary suspension for these 45 participating countries. This means only 1/3 of all the payments due to this period for these 45 countries. So only 1/3 was not canceled, but postponed. The main shortcoming of this initiative is that the private sector is not participating. Private creditors are not participating, multilateral creditors are not participating. There was a call from the G20 for voluntary participation of the private creditors, well, it's no news for us that the private sector will not participate voluntarily in an initiative like this. There is no existing framework for debt relief, for debt cancellation, for debt restructuring outside what they call the eligible countries for a DSSI. And it's important to understand that most of what the World Bank has called the new poor, so the people has been pushed into poverty because of the pandemic, are in middle-income countries that are excluded from this initiative. There's definitely no focus in human rights, in SDGs, in climate vulnerabilities, in choosing which countries are eligible for this debt payment suspension. And I think one of the most important things here is that there has been an exclusion from countries in the global south from the discussion, the decision making on those solutions, on this initiative and the next initiative, which is the common framework. The common framework is something that was approved in November last year, and it was presented as the solution. So the IMF, the G20 see this DSSI as a temporary solution. They acknowledge that this is temporary, that this is something addressing a liquidity crisis, a liquidity problem. And the common framework is presented as something that will tackle the debt sustainability, the problem, the rooted problems for debt payments. Well, the common framework actually remains kind of the same system that we already had with the Paris Club negotiations. The only novelty, which is important, is that China is brought into the table for negotiating debt restructuring. what it offers for this limited number of countries, it's offered to the same 73 countries that are eligible for DSSI, and so far only 45 have requested this DSSI. So it's limited to this number of countries. It does not ensure private sector participation. It commands the countries that seek this debt restructuring to seek what they call comparability of treatment from the private sector. So ask their private creditors, the private lenders, to offer the same level of deal that they can reach negotiating with their bilateral creditors. But it is kind of the same of the system we have now of countries by their own in the Global South negotiating with all their creditors, with the power imbalances that means in long processes where human rights or climate vulnerabilities or gender inequality are not in the table, and the only thing that is in the table is the capability of paying those debts. So far, only 3 countries have asked for this debt restructuring under the common framework: Zambia, Ethiopia, and Chad. And the only result has been, until now, that the credit rating agencies have downgraded these countries. That's the only so far result from this common framework. We understand this won't solve the systemic problems, the rooted problems that are leading to this debt crisis, or hence debt crisis. It's important to understand that this common framework is merely offering what they call a debt reprofiling. This is changing the periods for payment of the debts, of the outstanding debts, and the interest rates. Debt cancellation is only seen as a last resort, only in exceptional cases. And the restructuring of the debt is conditioned to adopt an IMF program. And we know the risks that this poses in terms of austerity measures and regressive policy and even tax conditionalities. The other response has been, and you might have heard that, the IMF debt relief under the Catastrophe Containment Relief Trust. This is an instrument that the IMF has. So the IMF has offered debt cancellation, debt payments cancellation to the IMF to 28 low-income countries in 2020 to 2022. The IMF is not paying for that. Don't worry about it. And IMF is asking for donor countries to replenish this catastrophe containment relief trust, so make donations to pay for that debt relief. And if we take into account all the payments by this set of countries called the DSSI countries, these 73 countries, this so-called debt relief by the IMF only covers 1/5 of the payments from these countries to the IMF. So it's peanuts, as we say. We understand this is what can be expected from an unfair and undemocratic debt architecture, where creditors are the ones deciding. Our creditors are both part and judges, are the ones sitting at the table at the G20 with the power to decide what to do. In the last G20 meeting, Mexico and Argentina, 2 of the countries in the Global South that are part of the G20, presented a proposal to change the eligibility criteria. So how it is decided that a country can actually access this debt restructuring, because we cannot say debt cancellation initiatives. Sorry. And that a new kind of vulnerability index could be created, including climate vulnerabilities. So we would consider where the different countries in the global south are in terms of fulfilling the SDGs, in terms of fulfilling gender equality goals, in terms of tackling the climate emergency, and then decide which were the ones that would need this debt cancellation or debt restructuring based on those needs and not on the level of income per capita. It won't come as a surprise again that this proposal by the only two global south countries in the G20, or not the only ones, but two of the global south countries in the G20 wasn't accepted or even discussed. So as said, false solutions that do not address the structural roots of the debt problems and perpetuate this neo-colonial regime for financial plunder that Maya was mentioning. What is our proposal here? I'm gonna add something to what Maya was mentioning in the lines of pushing for a multilateral debt restructuring framework, what we have been calling a debt workout mechanism. We understand we need a multilateral space, probably under the UN auspices, but at least managed by an independent body, not by the creditors, that can offer debt cancellation or debt restructuring to those countries that need it. That this level of need is decided from the country, and that can include debt audits as a process within this framework, and can include civil society participation as stakeholders of this multilateral mechanism. This is one of the lines we're pushing for, the workout mechanism, and we hope to have you on our side. As I said in the beginning, there is an urgency for debt architecture reform. This debt workout mechanism is part of that debt architecture reform. We also need to regulate the credit rating agencies, to regulate the financial sector, to bring more transparency from the private creditors. So it's a lot of work to do that will that have the debt situation in the global south in mind, but that can also help addressing the debt problems in the global north. We saw it in Greece a few years ago, and we see debt levels also rising in Europe. So this is for all of us, just to improve the international financial architecture. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Lolana. Lolana was from European Network for Tax Justice. Sorry, I didn't mention it earlier. So now we will move a little bit. We will switch our things from debt to the tax justice, because these both things are sometimes it looks they are separate, but they are not separate. They are very much related to. So we will talk about this now, and now I will invite Ida Jean Menipon. Sorry, Jeannie. I mostly know her as Jeannie. We know very well, but if I pronounce your name not correct, then please do it. So she is Development Finance Program Manager for APMD, and she will talk about Southern Framework and demands with a specific mention of tax justice, tax and gender justice, specifically related to the gender issues. It is over to you, Jenny. Hello, Jenny. Jenny, you need to unmute yourself. You are on mute.
Hi, I was trying to share screen, but there's something, let me see, something wrong. Just a moment, please. Wait a minute. Okay. Very sorry about this. My mouse is not behaving. Can you see now?
No,
Still
Jeannie,
not.
can someone
Uh,
else help you? Is there, if you are facing any technical issue?
yeah. Is it showing
Yeah,
now?
yeah,
Okay.
it's okay now.
So, good evening from Manila. Good day to everybody. My task is a very long title, Tax Justice in the Multiple Crises. So, Southern Frameworks and Demands, but we also have a specific interest to share with you our work around tax and gender justice. Okay. Hey, it's not moving. Something wrong. It's not moving. Okay. The multiple crises with their tragic and devastating impacts on people and the planet have exposed so acutely the deep flaws of the dominant neoliberal paradigm and the persistent issues plaguing systems of governance at all levels. In Asia, the economic downturn has been used by some governments to strengthen policies that serve the interests of wealthy corporations at the expense of people's health and security, cutting corporate income taxes under the guise of promoting investment to boost the economy. Ah, my goodness, sorry. In a study of public bailout funds in the Global South, the Financial Transparency Coalition found that the larger portion of COVID-19 so-called recovery funds in 9 countries, including 3 from Asia, Bangladesh, India, and Nepal, have gone to big corporations instead of welfare, small firms, or for workers in the informal economy. A staggering 63% of pandemic-related funds went on average to big businesses in 8 of the 9 surveyed countries, while only a quarter of the funds went to social protection. Inequalities, persistent and virulent, have gotten worse. So Oxfam already talks about the inequality virus. Just 10 people with the world's richest billionaires, and all men at that, have seen their combined wealth skyrocket by $500 billion since the pandemic began. That's more than enough to pay for a COVID-19 vaccine for everyone and to prevent the pandemic from pushing anyone into poverty. That's according to Oxfam. And we also ourselves witnessed the rise of vaccine chauvinism or vaccine nationalism or even vaccine apartheid, as a handful of giant pharmaceutical companies are using the global intellectual property system to prevent vaccines from being truly universally accessible. The People's Vaccine Alliance Asia estimates that in developing countries, only 1 in 10 people will get vaccinated by end of this year. This stark reality simply underscores the urgency and the imperative of advancing people's fights for social and economic justice in all fronts. APMDD's campaigns for tax and fiscal justice are grounded on people's struggles for survival and for justice. They are framed by a continuing critique of the role of finance, financial policies, institutions, and systems that are both expressions and instruments of inequality, and that have been triggering, fueling, and aggravating the multiple crises that have been burdening the majority of people for so many years. What are our key assertions and demands? Taxation is a means to raise revenues for the state to fulfill its obligations. It is vital that the state effectively and efficiently enforce tax policies that are just and progressive, together with other programs and policies that strengthen the domestic economy and the country's internal capacity to provide for its own finance needs. South governments must move away from resorting to borrowings and dependence on aid. Taxes should promote redistributive justice and substantive equality. Regressive taxes that do not account for differences in economic capacities and social position hurt women and the poor the most. They should be changed to minimize the regressive nature and, better yet, replaced with progressive policies that contribute to reducing inequalities. Taxation should not be an additional burden to those who do not earn enough or earn just enough to meet their basic needs and live a life of dignity. Domestic resource mobilization becomes even more pressing, yet challenging, especially for countries of the Global South. increasing domestic revenues through the adoption of just, progressive, and gender responsive systems, and channeling these revenues to finance public services essential to people's survival are urgently needed for COVID response. Moreover, they are key ingredients for building economies that are sustainable, transformative, and less dependent on debt and aid. But plugging the leaks is a must. In the face of the multiple crises, we cannot overemphasize the urgent need to plug the leaks which have been eroding the public funds of developing countries even before the pandemic. So in addition to debt servicing, the leaks include overly generous fiscal incentives across the region, including zero or light tax special economic zones that IFIs encourage. It also includes financial secrecy jurisdictions in the region that provide hiding places for corporate tax evasion and avoidance. In 2015 alone, Asian states lost billions in illicit outflows through trade. APMD is working for democratic, just financial systems and fiscal policies that are in support of sustainable, equitable, just, resilient, and post-carbon economies. We have two priority campaigns right now that are aimed at fairer, more equitable, and more progressive international and national tax systems and policies. One focus of the campaign is tax justice in the extractives industry. We aim to expose tax justice issues in this industry and to work for policies that lead to stricter taxation of corporations. On top of the negative impacts on human rights and environment, we all know that the extractives industry is fertile ground for corruption, tax abuses, and other illicit financial flows. But addressing all these issues effectively and building equitable, empowering, and sustainable systems and processes can only be done if efforts form part of the broader agenda of redressing the historically unjust and inequitable power relations between countries and within countries. We aim to win changes in policy and processes and structural changes to make systems more progressive, equitable, and less burdensome for the poor, gender just, and transformative, contributing to economic changes that move away from the profit-driven, extractivist, and neoliberal economic logic. May I now just share with you very quickly our demands for tax and gender justice. This is also the second priority campaign that we have. How do we make taxes work for women? We know that tax and fiscal systems are embedded in deeply entrenched patriarchal systems and practices. They reflect direct and indirect gender biases and assumptions. In many countries in Asia, they do not recognize women as independent economic agents or as heads of households. Unpaid care work, largely borne by women, are not accounted for and are rendered invisible in these policies. Women, especially those from poor and marginalized sectors, take on a disproportionate share of the negative impacts of regressive and discriminatory tax policies. They have the least voice, power, and influence in decision-making on these policies. We also saw in the time of the pandemic how women are exposed to multiple forms of gender-based violence, but ironically, they have less access to public services essential to their survival and to living a life of dignity. And wherever they are available, they are often inaccessible to women living in marginalized communities. Corporate tax abuses and IFFs that rob economies of revenues that could and should be used for public services really negatively impact on women's lives. What are our demands? First, reduce unfair tax burdens on women. We know that indirect taxes like the VAT and the GST hurt women and the poor the most, especially because women also continue to face a gender pay gap, which exacerbates the discriminatory impacts of VAT. Remove gender bias and discrimination in tax policies. Many tax systems still manifest explicit and implicit biases against women. Some policies are also founded on highly discriminatory marriage laws, family codes, and property laws. We also demand that tax policies ensure that they recognize and serve to represent, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work. Women's unpaid care work, valued at $10 trillion a year worldwide, even increased in the face of multiple crises. This should be addressed through a combination of policies like tax credits extended to unpaid care workers, public services, including socializing care work. We're keenly aware that in many parts of the world right now, women have amplified the call for the rebuilding of the social organization of care around. Now it is the 5 R's of care: recognize, reduce, redistribute, reward, and reclaim. Fourthly, increase allocation of tax revenues for gender-responsive social services. Under lockdowns, restricted mobility, and insecure livelihoods, women's exposure to gender-based violence increased. This compounds the already challenging reality of poor access to food, water, health, education, and other essential services. Loss of potential tax revenues due to corruption, tax abuses, and IFFs, combined with decades of austerity measures, debt servicing, privatization, have severely eroded women's access to quality public services. Fifthly, tax dodging and IFFs cannot be fought by national governments alone. International action is urgently needed. Unfortunately, international tax rules and processes are primarily set by countries in the north and heavily influenced by MNCs and global elites, resulting in what we already know are flawed, biased, and ineffective rules. Governments must establish a transparent and democratic intergovernmental tax commission under the United Nations to ensure that all countries can participate on a truly equal footing in the decision-making on global tax rules. As we say in the song, we need to rewrite the rules. Okay, that's it. That's it. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much, Amy. You explained very well that why we are talking about that we need to rewrite the rule and how we can make the tax working for the women, because these demands we put there, and we want this, that through these demands you can make the taxes work for women. Thank you so much, Jeannie. And there is one question I can see, but I think we can take the questions after our last speaker is there. Then we can take the questions. There is one question is there, but we can wait after the last speaker. We can take the questions. So we will move to the next speaker now. Tove Maria. She is Policy and Advocacy Manager at Tax Justice European Network on Debt and Development. And she will talk about the global tax architecture. So it's over to you, Tove Maria. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Saima. And first of all, warm thanks to APMDD for really lifting this and organizing this important event. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And yeah, the global tax architecture, I thought at first, building on Jeannie's excellent presentation, say a little bit about why this is important to discuss, especially in times of crisis, because I think Jeannie really well outlined the difference between regressive and progressive taxes. In essence, regressive taxes increase inequalities and progressive taxes reduce inequalities. And we are in such an extreme situation because of the crisis already. It has exacerbated the existing inequalities. And now it's basically a question of whether the tax system will make the problem worse or make the problem better. And the global tax architecture is important because unfortunately, there are some people that are easier to tax than others. And there are also some companies that are easier to tax than others. Especially when we look at progressive taxes typically target the wealthiest people in society and the biggest corporations, especially multinational corporations. And the thing that these actors have in common is that they are very internationally connected. So they are able to move their money around and use international tax haven structures, put very simply. That's not the case for example, ordinary women and mothers that go to the supermarket in a country. They're not able to use international structures to evade or avoid taxation. And the problem that we see is that unless we have an international architecture that can solve the problem of tax havens, governments find it really hard to implement effective wealth taxes and taxes on multinational corporations. So what they sometimes do, unfortunately way too often, is to look instead at those who, if you like, those who can't run away. And that's where we get regressive taxes, typically the value-added tax, which is the tax on everything you buy in a supermarket. So, of course, we have some governments that politically prefer regressive taxes, but unfortunately, with the current structures that we have and tax havens continuing to be a problem, we also simply have governments that turn to regressive taxation because they see that as the only realistic way of getting large resources collected. However, if we were to have an international architecture that was effective, we could find a lot of extra tax resources. There's a lot of discussion about exactly how much tax resources can be generated if we, for example, were able to make multinational corporations pay their share of taxes. If they were just able to pay the same as small and medium enterprises pay, if they would just pay the tax that is the corporate income tax rate, then we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. There's discussions about exactly how many hundreds of billions, but everyone agrees we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in extra tax income. So that is why there is a big global interest in trying to see how we can address the problem of tax havens. However, there is another very important part of this discussion, which is often more overlooked, but which is very politically important. And that is the discussion about, internationally speaking, if we look at a multinational corporation and we imagine that we get rid of the tax havens, that means we have a lot of new profits that can be taxed. The political question is who gets to tax them? Should this be, in rough terms, should this be developing countries or should this be developed countries? And this discussion is almost 100 years old. It was originally discussed in the League of Nations, which is what came before the United Nations in the 1920s. And there were two groups of proposals. The developing countries were arguing that multinational corporations should be taxed in the countries where they do business, even in the case where they don't have the headquarters in those countries. What is today known as the OECD countries were arguing that multinational corporations should primarily be taxed in the countries where their headquarters were. And of course, if you look at where corporate headquarters are based, it makes perfect sense for the OECD countries to argue in favor of a tax system that favors the headquarter countries, because that would favor the OECD countries. And this is an important part of the discussion, because if we look at how much more tax revenue countries can get, one is that the elimination of tax havens would just make everyone get more tax income. But secondly, this question of where the corporations should be taxed at the overall level is also something that really makes a big difference in terms of how much income, especially developing countries, would get. Unfortunately, the discussion was not solved in the 1920s, and it's still going on today. But what happened around 50 years ago was that the OECD started leading on setting international tax rules. And one of the first things that the OECD countries agreed was, of course, that the global tax system should be one that favors the countries where the multinational headquarters are based. The second thing that happened when OECD started leading on the rules was that we got eventually a new corporate tax system that is known as the transfer pricing system, and it's built on something known as the arm's length principle. Now, these are very, very complex rules, which is in itself a part of the problem, because there's so many loopholes in these rules that it's proven very difficult to use these rules to make multinational corporations pay tax. I often quote one of our dear colleagues from Society for International Development, Pooja Rangaprasad, who likes to ask the question when developed countries explain that they want to do capacity building of developing countries, and Pooja likes to ask, we see that multinational corporations are not paying taxes anywhere. They're also not paying taxes in Europe. So exactly what capacity is it that you want to transfer? The transfer pricing rules have failed everywhere. So that is a big problem that is getting a lot of political attention at the moment. And we're in the situation right now where the OECD is actually trying for the second time in less than a decade to fix the global rules. The first attempt started shortly after the financial crisis started 10 years ago. And in 2013, they started an official negotiation to fix the global corporate tax rules. And 2 years later, in 2015, they delivered a new package of rules, which was almost 2,000 pages long. Now, the first problem with these rules was that they were written in a negotiation where over 100 developing countries were not able to participate. The second problem with the rules was that they actually didn't solve the problem. They kept a large part of the system that wasn't working. After this package was decided, the OECD then set up a framework which is known as the inclusive framework. And I think there was an Indian negotiator in the United Nations that once said, a forum does not become inclusive just because you call it inclusive. And this is unfortunately also the case for the inclusive framework. It includes substantially more developing countries than were originally part of the negotiations. But in the inclusive framework, we still have 1/3 of the world's countries not being at the table. And for the least developed countries, it's 2/3 of the least developed countries that are not participating. And there are different reasons for this. They could actually join and come and participate if they wanted to. But in order to join, they have to sign up to the existing OECD rules and commit to implementing them. And exactly because of this discussion about whether tax should be paid in the home country of multinational corporations or in the country where business happens, some developing countries do not want to sign up to the rules because of this bias in where taxing rights are allocated. But and this then brings us up to date of where we are now. This inclusive framework is now negotiating the second attempt of trying to fix the global tax rules. And you might have seen in the news that we now have President Biden from the United States suggesting a new minimum tax globally of 21%. And these negotiations are actually in their final stage. They're supposed to be concluding this year. Originally, they said July. Now they're talking more about October. And and we'll see. But the negotiations are definitely in the final phase. And once again, we see problems with the bias of the rules that are being discussed, unfortunately. So there are two concerns. One is whether the rules will be effective. This remains to be seen. We still don't have the final proposal for negotiating text. So there's still the fear that there will be loopholes in the rules. And the second problem is that the rules that are being put together are very clearly favoring two types of countries. One is, again, the home countries of multinational corporations. These countries would get to eat first when the minimum tax is collected. So there's a very strong bias to the home countries again, for the simple reason that, of course, the big OECD countries are still very powerful in this forum. And secondly, it favors also countries where there are large groups of consumers. And of course, this is an advantage for large OECD countries and for some large developing countries, but especially for the least developed countries, there are some very big problems with the way that the right to tax corporations, that right is being allocated. And that gives me about 1 minute left to sum up some of the recommendations that Jeannie already presented. What needs to happen? Well, I mean, first of all, of course, we shouldn't have global tax rules being set in a forum where countries don't participate on an equal footing. And that's why we're strongly in favor of having the United Nations be the place where global tax rules are set. And luckily, we have over 130 developing countries that have supported this proposal. And in fact, you can say they were probably saying it before civil society was campaigning on it. They have been pushing very hard for a long time to have the United Nations be the place where global tax rules are set. There was also a report in February from a high-level panel known as the FACTI panel that also came out and said it's time to have the United Nations be the place where global tax rules are being set. And secondly, of course, in these negotiations, we need to link it to all the other things that the United Nations has committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, to gender equality, and to fighting climate change, and so forth. So it's very important that the global tax rules and the global tax negotiations really also look to the problems that our national tax systems need to resolve. So when it comes to the issues of, for example, women's rights, but also sustainable development, of course, these things need to be linked. And the new proposal that is emerging now is to have a UN tax convention that can both address the issue of tax havens, but can also start to really hash out how we can have a global structure that makes tax a part of the solution. And at the very least, make sure that we don't see so much regressive taxation and have our tax system become a part of the problem. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Tove, for this very specific and detailed information. So now it's time that we can take questions. I can read two questions there from Jaya Kumar Divaraj and from Malaysia. So there are two questions. They are related to the taxes. First question is our panelists who are who are on speak about the tax justice. Jeannie and Tove, Maria, they both of you, anyone can, I think, answer the question. There are two questions. First is how to avoid capital flight when you raise taxes on corporations. And the second one is Can we modify the free trade agreement to make the tax policies more fair? So, Jeannie, can you answer these questions?
That's very quick. Maybe, but also inviting Tove and even May, who's also very much knowledgeable. But first of all, perhaps that's one of the fears that some governments have in terms of raising or reducing corporate taxation because they think that this will discourage investments. But in fact, there are other studies that show that it doesn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily lead to capital flight because there would be other considerations in the business environment that corporations would consider in terms of at least for some of the industries. So I believe there are also some who are looking at the financial transaction tax or something that is also going to discourage or disincentivize capital flight. But I must confess I have not really studied the discussions about that also came up especially during the pandemic in terms of the menu of policy options that could be looked at. Yes, certainly you raised a very important point in terms of free trade agreements. We also need to do a little bit more work on that. And there are some sectors in government that may also really be interested to look at this. This is certainly a very important issue in the region, and we also need to do a little bit more work to focus on trade and tax issues. But that's all I can say for now. Thank you.
Saima, can I add?
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay, May
Okay.
and Top, do you want to say something about these questions?
That
Yeah,
maybe
First May, then Top.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So this is precisely the logic of, for example, the IMF that you must reduce your taxes so that you disincentivize the profit shifting. But I think that's a myth, and perhaps an example would be the extractive sector, where such resource-based investments are, the investors are looking for a very particular resource, and giving them very low taxes, lots of privileges is just, really increasing their profits, when they would have invested, when they would have made the investment anyway. So I think a lot of that also requires political will on the part of governments to look at tax as really one of the most powerful attributes of self-determination and sovereignty, and on how you can chart your way forward as a sovereign country. And on the free trade agreements, perhaps I don't know, but maybe it's not in the free trade agreements because perhaps it may, crucially, it's maybe more in the reform of the tax codes, the national tax codes. But then again, we also have to connect that regionally, because many laws are also being made at the regional level, and countries are being forced or compelled, pressured to comply with what's agreed upon regionally. So of course there are connections there, and when tariffs are also, they're not strictly tax, but they're a form of raising revenues. So that also links, especially to the issues of profit shifting and illicit financial flows. So over to you, Toby.
thank you so much. Yes, indeed, I very much agree with those comments. Yeah, in terms of capital flight, I mean, the problem right now is that the capital flies away regardless of the tax rates. We have profits flying out of all countries and landing in tax havens, regardless of what they were supposed to have paid in tax. And of course, that is because nothing can beat the rate that they get in a tax haven. If you look at the discussion on Apple and the profits that they moved to Ireland, they moved profits from Africa and Europe and India and the Middle East. They took the profits from all those countries and they put them in Ireland. And there they were offered a tax rate that many years were below 1%. And even in 1 year, it was 0.005%. So as long as we have tax havens, this whole discussion becomes a bit redundant. But secondly, what we see is indeed that if corporations would actually have to pay taxes where they do business, then they would have to really look at other factors as well. They wouldn't just move around based on the tax rates, because at the end of the day, there's a lot like to have decent infrastructure. They like to have healthy workers that don't have to do so much care work that they're not able to go to work. So they want well-educated workers, and basically multinational corporations, when it comes to choosing countries, they're a bit like us. They like well-functioning societies, law and order. So multinational corporations actually want the result of a functional tax system. They just don't want to contribute to it. So this myth that multinational corporations will run and set themselves up wherever they get a low tax rate is not true. And secondly, the discussion about having a floor under how low countries can go on the corporate tax rate is still important to take out the most extreme examples of countries that lowered. I mean, we still see some countries that put their corporate tax rates at 0. So there has to be a bottom on how low you can go. And yeah, on the tax and investment agreements, there's a lot of discussions. We tend to focus on the fact that if these agreements could at least not make the situation worse, we would be happy, especially when it comes to whether governments have a right to increase taxes on corporations. We sometimes see some of the agreements becoming a problem because corporations tend to believe that these agreements mean that they need to have tax stability. And there is a discussion about whether governments risk getting sued by corporations if they increase taxes on corporations. So that's a problem. And secondly, there are in some places we have seen rules that are typically trade related be used to try and make multinational corporations pay more tax, especially the state aid rules in Europe have been used to try and say, in the case of Ireland and Apple, the EU said, actually, you're not allowed, Ireland, to offer Apple such an extremely low tax rate, because that's actually unfair competition with all the other corporations that have to pay your normal corporate tax. But the European Commission tried to use the state aid rules to make Apple pay more tax in Ireland. But there are two problems with that. One is that they actually lost the case. It's getting appealed. They're still trying. But the second problem with that is that the case is only about the fact that Apple should pay more tax in Ireland. The case doesn't look at the fact that all those profits should never have been in Ireland. They come from Apple products sold in Africa, India, Middle East, and all of Europe. So the problem isn't solved just because Apple pays more tax in Ireland. Actually, we need to get those profits allocated to the countries where the business activity took place. So yeah, if the trade and investment agreements just don't get in the way, I think we would already, as a tax movement, be happy.
Thank you. I
There's
can
something,
see.
Saima.
Yeah, Lorana, I was coming to you because I can see that you want to say something. Please go on.
Sorry. No, just because we presented the issue of debt and the issue of tax, and actually capital flight is one of the linking issues between those two. So if you don't raise taxes because of fear of capital flight, you end up with only one way to finance your deficits and your investment in public services, which is borrowing. It's very, I know I'm simplifying it, but it's that simple. So if your revenues, your tax revenues are not enough, and the capital flight is happening anyway, that worsens your debt situation, and you end up with more unsustainable and even illegitimate debt, because you are covering the losses from those illicit financial flows, but also illicit legal capital flight with more debt that is your people who's going to be paying. So we need to discuss and push for capital controls. I know it's there is such a fear to do that because of the impact it might have in investments in the global south. But there is also a need to regulate this capital flows, and countries can establish capital controls. And we have seen in previous crises how establishing those capital controls can actually be beneficiary for the countries. So I think it's important we see it not as two boxes that are separate from each other, but as something that if you don't, I mean, there's no way you can reach debt justice if you don't have tax justice, and the issue of capital flight is crucial in there. I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Lolana. And just for the reminder, we just have, I think, 6 or 7 minutes left. So there is another question. That question is from Tony. Hi, Tony. So Tony Silvador is from Freedom from Debt Collection, Philippines. So the question is, if we in CSOs would like to engage on tax issues at the international level, which agencies should be approached? Which processes are more open to CSOs participation? Which ones should we avoid? Thanks. So anyone from the speakers? So who?
Ove, maybe that's more your...
Sure. Yes, thank you for the question, Tony. We have had amongst CSOs sometimes discussions about whether or not we should engage in the OECD inclusive framework process, but the discussion often turns a bit, again, redundant, because first of all, we end up commenting on the process no matter what, and our comments are normally quite important in the public debate. But when it comes to the negotiations, we're not allowed in the room when the negotiations take place. We're not even allowed to be in the building. We're not allowed to see the negotiating text before it's finalized. We have seen some leaks sometimes, but generally when it comes to being part of the negotiations, we're completely locked out. The mandate for these negotiations comes from the G20. That's another process we're not invited to really participate in. Whereas in the United Nations, of course, there are good and bad UN processes, and it varies how much CSOs can participate. But there is not one single of the UN processes that I'm aware of which are as bad as what we see in the OECD and G20. And in many of the processes, we can see the negotiations online. We can see what our governments are saying on our behalf. We can be in the room as observers. We can make statements. We can see the negotiating text. We can give governments proposals for what should be in the text and so forth. So it's another strong reason for why the United Nations is a better place to set global tax rules, is that citizens and civil society are actually allowed to be part of it and play a role.
Thank you. So I think we are just running out of our time, but we need our conclusion remarks from each of our speakers. So I would like to, but we have a very short time. I think I can request, can I request to all the speakers, if you can just take 1 minute, because earlier I was thinking 2 minutes, but now time is very short. So first of all, Maya, can you please give your conclusion remarks today?
Yeah, so we need to this webinar is really putting forward the linkages between debt and tax, and in the Philippines and many other countries, there's very clear linkages between allocating revenues for debt service. So that's a real issue. And then secondly, there's also been studies of a revolving door where during times where there was large external debts, there was also large capital flight. So that's another link. And for these reasons, I would just want to stress that debt cancellation, our fight for debt cancellation should really take into consideration all these connections to our context, and that the debt problem should be understood more broadly and deeply, because it's more than just, as Didi said, it's more than just a problem of insolvency and liquidity as the dominant institution would have us accept and believe. It's really a question that involves also systemic changes in society and economies. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Jeannie, it's over to you now.
Just very briefly, maybe we have painted, or I did anyway, probably paint a rather bleak picture of what we face in the multiple crises and the urgency of the tax and fiscal justice advocacy. But this is also the time that we have to find opportunities to really push for changes. We did not talk very much, but I think Tovi already mentioned it. There is some momentum that we could look at with the release of the UN the high-level FACTI panel report, and we need to find the links between our South and North advocacies around tax and debt to really seize the opportunities, because we do need to win some gains in our campaigning. That's all.
Thanks, Jeannie. Lolana, it's your turn now.
No, I know we're scared of time, but I would just mention that what Jeannie was just saying, we need to fight these fights together. Like, everyone has their own specificity and their own priorities, but it's clear that the fight for a UN tax convention and the fight for a debt workout mechanism is the same fight, which is let's reform the international financial system, including tax, including finance, including binding principles on responsible finance and lending. So we are part of that same process, and let's keep it that way.
And finally, Tove, it's over to you now.
Really don't have much to add, except that I think the good part about the tax situation is the message that there's actually lots of money. We just need to get it out from secret bank accounts and into public services. And indeed, we have a big battle ahead of us, but we also have a fantastic global movement, because this problem affects people all around the world. And I think engaging in this battle is also a great chance to get to work with a lot of fantastic people.
Thank you everyone. And finally, I just want to say that all of our struggles and campaigning and all of this, we will win one day. We will win this fight, and we believe on this. So thank you everyone. And I think it's time to.
And thank you, Simon.
Thank you to all of you Thank you to all of you, and thank you to all the panelists and the attendees who are there listening to the panelists. And I learned a lot from this webinar. Thank you so much.
Okay.